So for folks who are just joining, my name is Peter McCartney, the climate campaigner for the Wilderness Committee. Thank you so much for coming. This is an excellent lineup we've got for you today of experts to speak to the BC government's announced royalty review. Before we get started, I just wanted to acknowledge that myself, I am on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples here in what's now known as the West End of Vancouver. And I would encourage you to put where you're joining us from and whose territory you're on in the chat, so we can see all the corners of the province that people are joining us from. Once again, just a reminder, this is being recorded and we are using the meeting format. So if you have, if you would not like to be part of a recording, make sure to keep your video off and just keep your mute off until we call on you during the question and answer period. So the BC government's royalty review is finally announced. It's been a long time coming. Environmental organizations, including many of the ones on this call, have for a long time been pressing the government on the absurd amount of subsidies, $1.3 billion a year that they are giving the fossil fuel industry. And the royalty system that allows for 14 out of 15 of the top fracking companies in BC to actually pay less in royalties than, pay less in royalties and taxes than they receive in these credits. And Vanessa will talk about that shortly. So this is complicated subject matter, and we really want to give folks a chance to dive into it. So we've got a big question and answer period. We've got lots of time for discussion after our speakers today. And, we want to answer all your questions because this is a really important opportunity to end British Columbia's biggest fossil fuel subsidy. It's not the only one, but it's the major one. And come up with a royalty system, ideally, that will help us transition off of fossil fuels and address the climate emergency that we're seeing all too obviously in front of our eyes today. So we'll get right into it. I'll introduce our first speaker here. Vanessa Corkle is a policy advisor with the International Institute for Sustainable Development. And she's going to talk to us a bit today about royalty credits and BC's system and fossil fuel subsidies. Vanessa combines her climate change expertise with over 9 years of documentary journalism and nonprofit experience. In her work with IISD Energy, she focuses on topics such as fossil fuel subsidies, just transition, green recovery, and sustainable agriculture, as well as capacity building for communities, civil society, and government partners to develop and implement effective and equitable solutions to the climate crisis. Vanessa, please start us off.
Hi, everybody. So I'm going to share my screen eventually because royalties are a very nitpicky topic that I want to delve into. But first, a quick introduction. So I'm actually speaking to you today from the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples, otherwise known as Ottawa. I'm originally from Treaty 6 territory, and I spend a lot of time thinking about fossil fuel subsidies. So I hope that I can, in my presentation, help make that connection between the royalty review and fossil fuel subsidies, which is, I'm happy to say, gaining a lot of momentum. Not fast enough, but it is gaining momentum. And I'm happy to see so many people interested in providing input to this process because it is really critical. And this review is a very important. I cannot stress how important this review is. So it is fantastic to see so many of you interested in providing submissions. And I hope that our presentations today can help equip you to help push the government to go in the right direction. So in my presentation today, I'm just going to go over a little bit about what the royalty system is, what are royalties, why the system has been created the way it has been, and why certain royalty provisions are categorized as fossil fuel subsidies. Just kind of connected to the current global context. As you know, the UN climate conference just ended, and fossil fuel subsidies are actually one of the top items that were being discussed in the negotiations and were mentioned in the Glasgow Climate Pact. It's the first time that's happened at the UN climate negotiations. So this is something that's very top of mind. And we tend to talk about it in terms of national governments, but in Canada, we have 13 provinces and territories that all have their own fossil fuel subsidies. And so we really need the provinces and territories to step up. And because BC provides the second most subsidies of any province, we really need them to act as well. So just give me a second here while I share my screen. And if someone could tell me this is working. Yeah, perfect. Okay, so what is royalty? Okay, so first I want to step back and talk about minerals, fossil fuels. What are these? These are considered public goods. Governments are the resource managers of those public goods. So these are your public goods. When a company goes in and extracts something, whether it's hard mineral, whether it's a fossil fuel, that's something that is under jurisdiction of the province, except in some cases it's under jurisdiction of the federal government, but most of the time it's under jurisdiction of the province. That means you, British Columbians, or if you're calling in from a different province, maybe same case would be in your province, you own those mineral rights. And the government is just the resource manager on behalf of you. And as a resource manager, they set the conditions and the royalties for private sector companies. So essentially across Canada, provinces and territories that have significant mining activities, which includes fossil fuel extraction, have either taxes or royalty or a mix on those operations. So essentially the private company pays the government a royalty for the right to mine those minerals. So it says, in a sense, royalties are paid to compensate for use of that an extraction of that non-renewable public good. And they are a way for the value generated by that extractive industry to be shared between the mining company and the public, i.e. the government. So unlike a tax, a royalty is the share of the profits of a mine. Usually it's expressed as the percentage of profits, and they are collected by government and are supposed to go into the public purse to be used for things that benefit the public, like education and healthcare, et cetera. We could go down a whole other rabbit hole regarding what constitutes a public resource, especially in unceded territories, and whether, that's a whole other dynamic. I'm not going to go into that today, but just to say those dynamics are very alive and well, especially with the protests we are seeing and the arrests of journalists and Indigenous leaders in the past couple of weeks. But in a sense, this just gives you an idea of the concept behind royalties. So when we're talking about the value that's generated by extractive activities, this happens in different ways, right? So there's royalties that can be collected by governments. Governments might also be collecting land sale bonuses. There's the jobs and economic activity generated by the fossil fuel sector. There's taxes paid by companies and people working in the sector. That's to say British Columbians deserve their fair share of these values. And one of those is fair share by getting the maximum royalties that they should be receiving. However, as we all know, fossil fuel extraction is also creating other things like environmental damage and greenhouse gas emissions and causing climate change. So the royalty system has to also account for these, what we would call externalities, these negative impacts. So yes, fossil fuel, this is a thing we hear all the time, fossil fuel industry is, creating economic benefits. It's also creating a heck of a lot of social and environmental harms. And so our tax system and our royalty system need to be taking these into account as well. So just a quick recap. So taxes are not the same thing as royalties. Taxes are typically set up as corporate income taxes. A lot of provinces and territories also have separate taxes for mining exploration. Royalties, by contrast, are a percentage of profits made. And they are a way for governments and the private sector to share risks and profits. And the reason that has been done is because government historically has recognized that mining is a very upfront cost industry. So they have introduced royalty systems to reduce the risk for oil and gas companies or other mining companies. So their purpose is to encourage industrial activity. And this is a quote from the BC government website itself as one of the examples. So the Infrastructure Royalty Credit Program encourages new capital investment in oil and natural gas infrastructure beyond what would occur otherwise. So they, have acknowledged themselves the whole point of this royalty credit is to encourage industry to extract fossil fuels. That's the entire purpose of this royalty credit. And the royalty system has been set up in order to reduce risk for these private companies that are extracting fossil fuels. So just a recap is that the current system in BC favors gas production and favors private companies. Overall, and I'm going to go into the details of how these also equate to fossil fuel subsidies, but overall, the way that the current royalty system works is that it tips the scale in favor of fossil fuels, and it distorts the market against clean energy solutions and the sustainable energy that we need for the future. So many of the programs that exist, whether they're royalty reductions, royalty credits, there's other types as well that I'll mention later on, is that those are intended to develop and explore and produce fossil fuels, full stop. And that, given the context that we're in, the understanding we have about climate change, I think we can all agree that is not a desirable policy goal. So what is a royalty credit? So basically, royalty credits and reductions reduce the amount of royalties that a company has to pay to the government. So there are lots of different mechanisms in BC. The biggest one, which you may have heard about already, is the Deep Well Royalty Credit Program. This is the most egregious, but there's a lot of other smaller ones as well. A lot of these have been around for years. Some of them are created very recently. The Clean Growth Infrastructure Royalty Program is one of those. In the fossil fuel subsidy world, we call these a foregone revenue subsidies. So they're not money that the government is spending per se, but it's money that they're not collecting. So it's foregone revenue that they are not collecting and cannot use to spend on public goods, including things like climate change action. So just to bring us back to where the fossil fuel subsidy conversation is worldwide, we just came out of COP26, the UN Climate Change Conference. I mentioned that for the first time, fossil fuel subsidies was included in the decision text. And UN Chief Antonio Guterres, who has been extremely vocal on this issue, said at the end of the conference that pledges made at COP are hollow unless countries actually deal with fossil fuel subsidies. We can throw as much money as we want at the climate crisis. As long as we're throwing money towards the fossil fuel industry, we're going to be undermining and eating our own tail. So this is a really critical issue worldwide right now. And just to be perfectly clear, I think we're all on the same page here. Are royalty credits and reduction subsidies? Yes. And, Premier Horgan has addressed this himself, actually. You may have seen this tweet, and you may have seen it otherwise in other places. I'm not actually sure, but he says in his tweet, as we eliminate outdated, inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, we want your input. So I just want to draw attention to this word that he uses called inefficient, and explain why this is there and why we need to push back against it, and why I'm hoping some of you will push back, all of you will push back against this in your submissions. So the word inefficient shows up in the COP Glasgow decision text, and actually dates back at least to 2009, when the G20 countries, including Canada, agreed to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies in the medium term, which has since shifted to 2025 is kind of the deadline. And Canada itself has committed to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies by 2023. The problem is that there is no agreed upon definition for inefficiency. There is, however, an agreement internationally on what a subsidy is, and that is something that the World Trade Organization has defined, and over 170 countries have agreed to that. So this word inefficient has kind of been put in there as a political ploy to get as many people to agree to phase out subsidies as possible. But it's kind of become this zombie word because it keeps showing up in all these different international negotiations. Often when organizations and summits are trying to put together agreements on subsidies, this word sneaks into it again, which is exactly what happened at COP. And now what we're seeing is that subnational governments are also adopting that same language. And the danger with this is that when governments define inefficiency on their own, there's a lot of room for error, and there's a lot of room for a lack of ambition, let's just say. So just to quickly summarize, fossil fuel subsidies cost a lot of money, they're expensive, they incentivize the pollution that we need to be stopping, and they disadvantage clean energy and distort the market because they make fossil fuels seem artificially cheaper. Royalty credits and reduction are what we call production fossil fuel subsidies. So they lower the cost of business for fossil fuel producers. They have more for their bottom line, thus enabling increased production. You know, we spoke about earlier how that's literally the goal of them, is to incent activity that wouldn't otherwise happen. And what happens in BC is that producers can bank credits for future years, which reduces the cost of business for them in the future as well. A great blog that came out today, and I will find the link and put it in the chat, so I didn't send it to the organizers ahead of time, really summarizes this issue well. All fossil fuel subsidies are inefficient because they form a roadblock to effective climate action and sustainable development. When governments are talking about fossil fuel subsidies, they need to be considering social, environmental, and economic considerations, and they need to be demonstrating that all of those considerations have been addressed. They should be transparent about how they're addressing them. So when we're talking about economic considerations, we should be including what are the economic costs of climate change going to be, and also what are the financial risks, including of stranded assets in a world that's shifting to net zero. I would argue that many of the royalty credits and reductions that are in place are risky from an economic perspective as well, because they are encouraging an industry that we know, according to the International Energy Agency, has a very hard climb ahead of it in terms of the finances alone, given the international trends towards clean energy, let alone the fact that we should just not be investing in it at all because of climate reasons. So I would hope that all of you can identify the need for these really strict criteria on inefficiency, and the ask for governments to be transparent about that analysis when they come up with their final decisions. So are these types of subsidies inefficient? Yes. I just also want to do some quick myth busting. Sorry, I'm just waiting for everyone to mute. Some quick myth busting that you may have seen in the media or maybe by the private sector. These pop up pretty often, which is that tax breaks and royalty relief are not technically subsidies. Under international definitions, the World Trade Organization, these are one of the main types of subsidies that they've identified. So yes, these are subsidies. If you have information, want more information about that, we have some resources on our website. You can feel free to contact us afterwards. Another myth is that money that is intended to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is not a subsidy. So for example, the Clean Infrastructure Royalty Credit is supposed to put to save companies money so they can put that money towards greenhouse gas emissions projects. Yes, in theory, there's an environmental benefit, but actually this money is still lowering the cost of business for fossil fuel producers, so it's still a subsidy. And I would also say that evidence that we've seen from many other examples is that instead of having strong regulations, and governments try to put these like carrot programs in instead of using sticks, and what happens is that companies end up just saving the money they would have invested in clean solutions anyways and putting it towards more production. So it's actually not very efficient, and there need to be strict criteria if that kind of program exists to make sure that that's not what's happening. And then of course, this is something that we hear very often, which is that removing subsidies, removing these royalty credits and programs would mean that we'd be advocating for job losses in energy and security. On the flip side, I would say that reforming some of the royalty programs can help us transition to clean energy systems. It can free up government cash to invest in those clean solutions, help us with a just transition to create jobs, and enhance energy security by investing in long-term clean energy solutions that are more reliable and that have way less volatile markets. So I just wanted to draw attention to the case of Alberta before I wrap up. Alberta went through its own royalty review a couple of years ago. They were providing almost $1.5 billion in royalty credits in 2017. And after the review, that went down by just around 600 million. And so in 2019, they were looking at about 940 million of royalty credits. And then last year, during the year of COVID, that dropped even further to 500 million. So This looks like they have made a lot of progress, but I just want to point out that the drop is not only because of the systematic changes they made in the royalty regime, but it's also because of COVID impacts on producer profits. Because remember, royalties are a percentage of producer profits. They're not based on your total income. And that means that in a year where there's low profits, royalties are also going to be low. So this is actually a case of what not to do. We're still seeing that Alberta is providing a lot of fossil fuel subsidies because they haven't fully integrated, in my opinion, environmental considerations into their new royalty regime. And there are some recommendations in the independent assessment that was done for BC that point to Alberta as a good example. I think that's problematic. I think the evidence is on the screen ahead of us, and we need to be more ambitious than that. So just to paint where the royalty review fits in, this is a figure from a paper that ISD put out a few months ago about how we can recover from COVID fossil free. And there's a lot of different things we need to do that, right? We need a just transition for workers and communities. We need to be working towards our 2030 greenhouse gas emission reduction targets and towards our net zero targets. And one of the clearest ways that we can do that is to stop providing money to fossil fuel production and to properly tax fossil fuels, and that includes setting proper rates for royalties for fossil fuel extraction. Then we need to be swapping that support from fossil fuels to clean energy so we can start incentivizing adoption and production of clean energy. So all of these things sort of fit together. I know sometimes people talk about, people are always saying like, okay, you're spending a lot of energy on fossil fuel subsidies. Well, we want your solutions. And I think we need to reframe this as, this is a key enabling condition. Dealing with the royalty regime is a key enabling condition so that we have the resources and financial capacity to deal with the other stuff. So I think that's it. I don't want to go too much over time, but I'm happy to answer questions later on. And I will pass it back to Peter. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thanks so much, Vanessa. That was fantastic. What a good primer on the system that we're dealing with and sort of what needs to get started on how we change it. So yeah, just thank you so much. And thanks for staying up late for us. Our next speaker will talk a bit about what a royalty system that actually takes those environmental, social, and economic considerations that Vanessa had mentioned into account. And so our next speaker is Tom Green from the David Suzuki Foundation. His expertise is in ecological economics, climate solutions, renewable energy, and clean transportation. He has a BIS in environmental studies, an MA in ecological economics, and a PhD in ecological economics. And they have just been working on a paper about incorporating climate into this new royalty review. So go ahead, Tom, take us away.
Yeah, thanks, Peter, and thanks for inviting me here today to join with this. I'm so pleased to see this many people to feed into or trying to learn about the royalty review and how we might influence that through submissions and whatnot. It is, I agree with Vanessa, and Vanessa's a hard act to follow because she works on subsidies all the time and she's incredibly knowledgeable. So certainly I agree with the point she's been making, and the idea that there are efficient and inefficient subsidies is something we've got to get away from. All subsidies that are keeping us in hurling towards a climate emergency are clearly inefficient. So just as a bit of context, DSF's work, we've been pushing for stronger federal and provincial methane regulations and supporting independent monitoring of field trips. And that kind of monitoring is showing that BC's methane emissions are 1.6 to 2.2 times more than what's recorded in the official inventory. So BC has a real emissions problem. But the bigger problem that I think we face in this province is we still have a government that believes that economic development, that the province's economy is supported by a foundation of natural gas production and LNG exports or fracked gas production, and that we want to enable this. So you'll see in the discussion paper, there's a discussion of competitiveness analysis to see how competitive is BC on its royalty rate compared to other jurisdictions in North America. So there's this fear that in this royalty review, if we make the royalty rate go up too high, it's going to scare away the oil and gas industry, or fewer and fewer wells are going to be produced. And that would have a terrible effect in that production would go down. We'd see industry move elsewhere. And of course, that would mean some changes in jobs, but it would also create new opportunities. And that's the kind of thing we need to address in just transition. So one caution I have in both the discussion paper and the expert panel's report is they try and discourage us from accounting for climate damages in the royalty rate. And so I'm going to explain why it would be really important to increase the royalty rate to account for those climate damages, and why it's completely in alignment with economic theory. So, you know, we're already at 1.1 degrees Celsius. Going to 1.5 is truly going to be awful. So clearly, most BC's gas must stay in the ground to contribute to that global effort to avoid going to 1.5. So the purpose of the review, the way it was, the expert panel was given this task, did include the environment climate. And there's some choice quotes that can be found in the report if you just search under climate that show that their objectives were to secure a fair return for BC's natural resources, contributing to a strong economy with employment and training opportunities, etc. And supporting BC's climate commitments and protecting and enhancing BC's air, water, land, and ecosystem environmental resources. So the mandate was to include that, but the recommendations pull back from that, and the panel and the discussion paper try and suggest we shouldn't include this. I'm going to be drawing on some work by an economist known by the name Brian Prest, who's with Resources for the Future, a US nonprofit, and he's testified before Congress on the need for a climate royalty surcharge. So that's the idea that one would add to the royalty rate a surcharge to reflect these climate damages. And as broader context, here in BC, the government is saying, and the discussion paper is discouraging us from looking at adding such a surcharge. Biden's executive order 14008 instructed the Secretary of the Interior to examine the climate and other environmental consequences of the federal mineral leasing program, which would include gas production, including considering, here I quote, whether to adjust royalties associated with coal, oil, and gas resources extracted from public lands and offshore waters, or take other appropriate action to account for corresponding climate costs. So there we have it, in that the world is moving on. This idea that your royalty system should be designed to be competitive, to encourage as much oil and gas production as possible while giving some return to the public purse, is an outdated one. We have to take into account that the science is showing us that we're in a climate emergency, that we've got to bring down emissions really, really rapidly. And one way to do that is to increase the royalty rate. So there's going to be two objections about doing that. The first is that leakage, the idea that if BC were to increase its royalty rate to reflect climate damages, then what will happen is producers, oil and gas companies will go to other jurisdictions and extract gas there. And so the global climate is no further ahead, because it doesn't matter wherever the gas is extracted. Once it gets burned, it adds to climate damages. Now, There is some validity to that argument, but it's limited because the research shows that when you reduce production in one jurisdiction, it doesn't get compensated for in other jurisdictions. The other problem with that argument is that if every company or country in the world or every province and state makes that argument, then we're never going to get anywhere. We actually have to start capping production from the oil and gas sector. The second objection that some might have is that the question of double counting. So in other words, if we already pay a carbon tax in BC, why would we add a climate royalty surcharge to that gas? But the reality is that only 12% of BC's gas production actually gets used in the province. And so most of it is exported to the US where it isn't subjected to a carbon tax. One of the arguments also in the discussion paper is that it's not an appropriate place to, let me just find my note here. It's not appropriate to apply a surcharge or to adjust the royalty rate to reflect emissions because we have other policies such as regulations on the oil and gas sector to reduce their emissions. Well, that argument also doesn't hold because if you take into account the fact that governments, both federally and provincially, put regulations to reduce emissions. So for instance, they put regulations on the efficiency of our vehicles, and they put building standards to improve the efficiency of buildings. And yet at the same time, there is a carbon tax placed on top of the or fuels used in buildings or in cars have this carbon tax applied to them. So the fact that we regulate the oil and gas sector and force it to reduce its emissions over time, although the province is obviously not doing a very good job on that, is not a reason not to put a carbon charge, climate damages surcharge on top. The royalty review expert paper has a small discussion on the question of how we should address climate in the royalty review, and that happens mostly between pages 55 and 56. But as I've mentioned, they pull back from saying whether we should put a surcharge on it. The only thing they say is that some of these credits and so on, these giveaways that, as Vanessa pointed out, encourage marginal production and encourage production that wouldn't occur otherwise. And so we should get rid of that. So that's a very marginal adjustment, and it gets rid of some of the worst aspects of this design, but it's not addressing this need for a sea change from going from viewing the industry as a positive contribution to society's economic welfare to something that's endangering us, and therefore that we need to change the incentives and reduce its production. So I'll try and wrap it up here. I just want to say a couple more things here. We have to not be distracted or not buy into the government's agenda of encouraging the industry. It's no longer time to encourage the industry. Competitiveness should not be a main priority for us. And looking through documents from the Canadian Association for Petroleum Producers, CAP, we can see that government has been unduly influenced by their priorities and their view of how beneficial this industry is to the province, and the CAP's concerns about maintaining competitiveness and ensuring that there's ongoing capital investment. So the key idea is, according to Brian Prest, we should be adding a surcharge, quite a substantial one. So if you look at the effective royalty rate in British Columbia, it's 2.4%, which is very, very poor compared to the federal US rate, which is 12.5%. And private landowners in the US are achieving about 20%. So BC's already getting very, very low value on it. But with a climate damages or a climate royalty surcharge, we should be increasing the royalty rate by about 20 to 39%. 20 to 50%, and 39% is probably about the right rate. So we should be looking at, more a royalty rate of about 41% instead of 2.4%. Now, if we were to put that into place, would production decrease over time in British Columbia? Absolutely. But we would only be drilling, or industry would only be drilling wells where the benefits or where the value of that gas is very high. And over time, the total production in BC would go down quite substantially and eventually would phase out the industry. So it might have to phase in that idea of a climate royalty surcharge and make it go up 5% every year until we reach, 50% or something like that. But that's consistent with the theory that the benefits and the costs include climate damages and should be accounted for in the overall. So sorry, I didn't have a nice presentation to sum that up. It's been a super busy week on climate, or last couple of weeks, but I'm happy to answer questions. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Tom, for your presentation and for your knowledge and for your efforts on making this review actually successful and work for the environment as it was promised. Unfortunately, our third speaker do we have Ben Parfit on the line already? I think Ben managed to double book, and so he should be on any moment here, but maybe what we'll do before then is introduce our two co-hosts, Sven Biggs from Stand.Earth and Alexandra Woodsworth from the Dogwood Initiative. Have been working as well on royalties, and we're all hosting this webinar together. And so I'd want to turn it over to them maybe just before Ben gets here, and they can talk a bit about what we can do and how we can participate in the royalty review and some of the things we're hoping to ask for. So Sven, Alexander, is that all right?
Sure. In case folks didn't realize this, we allured you all here to get you to submit your own personal comments to the royalty review process. So Alexandra and I will just walk you through some of the things that you might want to include in your comment. We'll start off with some of the stuff that our first two speakers have already covered. Of course, the number one ask we want to make in our comments is to end the handouts, to abolish the deep well credit and the other subsidies embedded in our current system, including schemes like the Clean Growth Infrastructure Program. It sounds nice, but really in the end, it's helping incentivize more fracking and distorting our system. We also know that we are in a climate emergency and that we have to deal with these subsidies if we're ever going to meet our climate goals. So that's why we need to phase out these royalty subsidies in next year's budget. We're also, of course, going to continue to work to phase out other fossil fuel subsidies that aren't embedded in the royalty system. Second point that Tom made really well, of course, is that we need to raise the rates to help fight climate change. And it's not just me and Tom saying things like that. the Premier and the provincial government have said that they see changing the royalty system as a way to meet their climate goals. So we have to hold them to that commitment. We think, as Tom said, that royalty rates should reflect the social and environmental costs of fracking and other fossil fuel extraction, and that they should continue to raise over time to help us meet our climate targets and phase out the industry. I think the other point we need to make here is if the industry gets away, they're pushing for super low royalty rates. And that would effectively hide the subsidies that they're currently getting now, but not effectively deal with them. I'm going to pass it over to Alex now, who's going to talk about the next couple of points. Alex?
Thanks, Ben. And yeah, great to see all of you on here. I'm Alexandra from Dogwood, calling in from Seychelles territory on the Sunshine Coast. And the next point we want to make sure that we cover in all of our submissions, in all of our work, and is foundational really to everything that we are doing, is to respect and uphold Indigenous rights in the development of this new royalty system. So obviously the events we've been seeing in Wet'suwet'en and Gitxsan territory in the last week show us what happens when projects and policy move forward without consultation, without consent of Indigenous peoples who are affected and whose land all of this is happening on. BC has a law on this front, the BC Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and it really commits the government to developing all new policy and law in line with the UN Declaration, which includes the principle of free, prior, and informed consent. So the way we're going to be calling for this is that this new system needs to be developed in full partnership from the beginning with traditional and elected Indigenous governments whose territories are impacted, and that's at the whole way through, from extraction to transport and export of gas. And I think the other way to think about all this, of course, is this, the concept of royalty, the concept of the crown, it's in the name, right? A modern understanding of this, of fees paid for a resource that's claimed by the crown, but is taking place on stolen land, and should include provisions for revenue sharing, for sharing whatever the new system looks like, whatever the income that's coming in should be shared with affected First Nations. So that's another piece to consider in your submission. Fourth point that we're all really encouraging people to talk about is water. And Ben Parfit is the expert, and he's going to walk you through all of that. But the bottom line is that the fracking industry pollutes billions and billions of liters of fresh water every year. Companies suck water out of lakes and rivers, add a toxic soup of chemicals, blast it underground. And once the water is used, it's so polluted that it can't be used. It can't be returned to the environment. It's lost from the water cycle forever. So under some pretty crazily outdated regulations, and totally unlike other industries, fracking companies pay almost nothing to use, in other words, to poison this most precious resource that we have. Ben's favorite stat is less than a cost of a pint of beer for every single Olympic swimming pool size worth of water. So there are different ways that the government could tackle this, but the point we really want to make is that fracking industry is getting a free ride when it comes to water as well. They need to take another hard look at that. It's another form of hidden subsidy in this industry. There's a couple of ways they could do that, but that's part of this whole concept of setting rates that include the full environmental costs of this super destructive industry. So that is the kind of 4 key highlights that our organizations are calling for, that we think are what a fair system would look like, what a modern system that upholds Indigenous rights and fights climate change should look like. And we really think these are the most important things for folks to highlight in their submission. But of course, as Tom was walking us through, there are highly complicated discussion papers, and the government's website is asking some pretty complicated and technical questions of the public in their official feedback form. I would argue you don't have to be boxed into that feedback form. You don't have to answer for your submission to count or to make an impact. The most important thing is to write it in your own words, say why you care, cover these key points that that we've covered. But for those of you who do want to answer those questions, we're going to walk you through the 4 or 5 bullet points that they're asking for, and offer our perspectives on that. And then it's really up to you which, if any of these you want to cover in your submission. So the first thing they ask about is, you know, the balance between environmental protection, which, you know, in this case really gets back to that fundamental question of climate, what they call a fair return to the public, and economic development. These are the words that they use. And I think this gets back to what Vanessa was talking about with respect to, you know, some of these myths that really circulate around subsidies and around this industry. I believe that investing in the low carbon economy, instead of propping up the fossil fuel industry with these subsidies, is the way that we secure economic development, that we secure our prosperity for the future. Obviously, we only need to look around at the billions in damage that we faced, you know, from this week's flooding to see the costs of inaction. And there's a lot of evidence out there that these, you know, this whole industry is a sunset industry. The economics are super marginal. And, you know, betting big on this industry is really setting up the BC workers, the BC towns that are going to, you know, being built around it, for whom we talk, when we talk about economic development, this is all about and for, is really setting these, you know, these communities and these workers up for big losses in the future. So that is kind of how, you know, I think people should be talking about when they're answering this kind of question. One other piece to note that I think it's pretty crazy, the way the government talks about fair return to the public resource in their discussion paper. They kind of twist it beyond all recognition. Like when us lay people think of fair return, we think about sharing the value of this resource, as Vanessa was talking about, you know, more fairly between these private companies and us as the public. The way the government's conceptualizing in their discussion paper is really about maximizing the size of the economic pie by generating more production. So there's some kind of pretty kind of pretzel, they're twisting themselves into pretzels to justifying continuing production. And this goes back to those worrying signals that really do reveal the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the government's climate policy here, this false belief, and we know it's a false belief, that we can keep expanding oil and gas and really tackle climate change. It's not something that's possible in the long run. And I think it's a signal that does show us what we're up against, and why we all need to be speaking out really firmly against that in our submissions. So I'm going to hand it back to Sven to talk about two of the other government's questions.
Okay, this is where it gets a little bit technical. They one of the questions they ask is about what type of royalty structure they should use. It seems really technical. They offer three options. We suggest that you should recommend a flat rate on gas production as the option, or option one in the discussion paper. The other two options that they outline involve something called capital cost recovery. Basically, it would allow the fracking companies to get back the money they have to spend to drill the well off the top before they pay any royalties, and would transfer most of the risk of oil and gas extraction to us, the public, instead of the companies. So we strongly recommend going with option one there. It's the most transparent, and it is the most likely to return value to the public of the three options. The next question they ask is about how quickly we should transition to a new royalty system. Fortunately, if you go with option one, because it's more transparent and more straightforward, the transition can be relatively quick, maybe a year and a half, which we compared it to Alberta, who went through a similar process in 2017. They gave themselves 10 years to phase into the new process for existing wells, which means that there are potentially still wells in Alberta under the old royalty system, even though it was changed under the Notley government. So we recommend a quick transition under the simpler system. And then finally, they ask what should happen with outstanding royalty credits. As you might know, because fracking companies have been able to collect more credits than they've been able to use, they've accumulated somewhere in the neighborhood of $3.1 billion in outstanding royalty credits. We think that it would be unfair to allow the companies who have manipulated the existing system to maximize their credits to be able to cash these all in before transitioning to a new system. So everything possible that the federal or the provincial government can do to reduce that burden needs to be done. And part of that is the quick transition. Alex is going to explain a little bit now about how you can submit your own comment. And then I think we've got Ben on the line, so we can go to him soon. Thanks.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, so there's a bunch of ways that you can have your say. You can send an email directly from your own inbox to the government's consultation email address, which is royaltyreview@gov.bc.ca. We don't really recommend the survey because it doesn't allow you to express any of your own perspective or cover off any of these key points. It really boxes you into to their super technical questions. So for those who want to participate on the government site, we recommend just drafting your own email and sending it off to that address. And then all three of us organizations on the call tonight, us and Stand and Wilderness Committee have all developed tools to make it super easy on our website. So you can head on over to any of those, and I think Soleil is dropping some of those links in the chat now. That's the easiest and fastest way to hit the highlights. All of them cover the kind of key points that Sven and I have just walked through, and you can hit submit and it will go directly to the government's inbox. So that's another way to go for it. So I know a lot of you are super engaged and have been following this issue really closely. Some of you may have already submitted through one of our websites. It's absolutely fine to make another comment, a more personalized one, now that you've had all this great information. And if you've used one of our form letters, you will certainly have more impact if you craft your own in your own words. A couple other ways that you can help. We know that CAP and industry is pushing hard on their side of the aisle, so we really need to be louder. We need to flood this consultation with calls for climate action, for common sense, for fairness. So we need more people than are on this call, more people who are on our email list, people who aren't necessarily always part of this to make comments as well. So please share on social media. We've got some graphics on all of our channels that can help you do that. And just pop an email off to your friends and family asking, 3 or 4 after tonight's call, folks who care about the climate and say this is a really practical way that you can do something right now. And the last option is if you're super keen, you've done all those things, you've got time for more, we are organizing some phone banks over at Dogwood where you can join and make phone calls to folks to help encourage more people to make submissions as well. So there are lots of ways to help and really help spread the word and make sure we go beyond the choir, because we know that we're going to need that those broader voices from across BC from all walks of life to have their say as well. And all of this is going to be coming at you along with some of the resources that Soleil has been including in the chat and the articles and the blogs that really explain all of this, that gather everything together, because I know it's a lot of information, is all going to come to you in one handy email after this event. So that's it from me for now. We'll hand it back to Peter to introduce us to Ben.
Yeah, thanks Alexandra and Sven and Dogwood and Stand for all the work you're doing to get folks out to the Royalty Review. So I believe we have our last speaker, Ben, on the line. Thanks for your patience, folks, as we change things up. And don't worry, all the information that we just went over will be sent out in a follow-up email. So allow me to introduce Ben Parfit. Ben is a researcher at the CCPA. He joined the staff team as a resource policy analyst in 2005 after years of working as an investigative journalist with numerous magazines. And previous to that, he was a reporter with the Vancouver Sun. He's the author and co-author of 2 books on forestry issues and currently devotes much of his policy research to natural resources, with special attention paid to water, energy, and forest resources and climate change. Ben, I can ask you to take us away.
Sorry about that. Thank you very much, Peter, and my apologies for joining late. I was kind of double booked tonight. So I'm thrilled to see so many people on this call. the CCPA, I'm working very closely with Mark Lee on developing a response and submission to the royalty review. And we will, we're very close to having it done, and we'll share it with the group as soon as we have it done, which I think should be in the next couple of days. So I just wanted to give people a little bit of a flavor for and some of the context to, I think, what's going on here, and urge people, you know, to make certain points clear to the government in their submissions. One of the things that you know, is very, very clear is that we've seen a tremendous increase over the last 10 years in the amount of gas and liquids being produced, and a commensurate, very, very sharp decline in the total royalties that are being collected. So we've seen, you know, royalty payments that were well over $1 billion per year, ratcheting down to around 200 million in the most recent year, while the level of production overall in the province has increased has almost doubled over the same period of time. So that's a critical piece of context here that I think it's really important for everybody to be flagging in any submissions that they make to the province. The other thing that we're trying to impress upon people is that the access to information that the public has on what companies are actually paying by way of royalty fees is completely untransparent. We do not have information before us, and we should have it before us if we're going to be involved in trying to influence government policy on this issue. We should know what the companies are actually paying by way of royalty payments, and we don't have that information before us. And very importantly, we don't have information that breaks down in any kind of meaningful way what companies are paying by way of royalties on gas versus what they're paying on the liquids that are being produced, which quite frankly is the most valuable of the assets that the companies are currently producing in Northeast BC. Very important to note that there is a great geographical disparity right now in terms of where the companies are targeting most of their development activities today. Most of the development is occurring in the South Montney region, and most of it is occurring there for the very simple reason that those assets contain very large liquid components, in particular condensate, which is extremely valuable for diluting bitumen in Alberta's tar sands. So we are going to be trying in our submission to highlight the fact that there is very, very little information available to the public on the royalty rates that are being charged for individual companies, let alone what the royalty rates are for the very valuable liquids versus the gas. The South Montney region, for all intents and purposes right now, is a liquids play. It's not a natural gas play. And the public really does not have a handle on what the royalty rates are for condensate and the other gas liquids. So in our submission, we're going to be concentrating very heavily on the fact that there is little transparency in that area. The other thing that we're going to be doing, and we encourage people to do, is to realize that most of the value that the government has collected to date really has nothing to do with royalties. It has to do with the sale of subsurface rights. And it's the subsurface rights that have really generated the greatest revenues to date, not the royalty payments themselves. So we're trying to highlight that fact, and we think it's important to highlight it in the submissions that are made. Similarly, we think that we should use the fact that this review is underway to highlight the great disparity between the revenues that are collected by the Crown and the revenues that are then turned over to First Nations through revenue sharing agreements. So one of the things that we're going to be advocating for in our submission is that if there are changes to the royalty regime and there is an increase in royalties, that there should be a change in policy that results in fully half of everything that is generated by way of royalty revenues going to First Nations in the northeast of the province, because it's their lands and resources that are being most significantly impacted, of course, by the oil and gas developments themselves. Very important, I think, to note the landmark decision by in BC Supreme Court earlier this year, Yahi versus British Columbia. The Blueberry River First Nation won a landmark ruling before the BC Supreme Court on cumulative impacts in their territory. This is where most of the natural gas developments are occurring and the greatest impacts are occurring. So what we're suggesting is that people think through finding a way in their submissions to say that a portion of these resources ought to be, a significant portion ought to be shared with the First Nations in the province. So we're really trying to focus on the fact that there's a lack of information, critical information, baseline information before the public in terms of what companies are actually paying, no real transparency around those payments, no significant splitting out of the royalty charges and payments for the liquids versus the gas, and a gross disparity in terms of the revenues collected and then turned back over to First Nations. So as I said at the beginning, we have this submission almost ready to go, and we will be sharing it out with everybody on the group and encouraging them to get their submissions in. And lastly, we are also asking for the government to at least consider expanding the review on royalty charges to include a review of effectively the royalties that the natural gas companies are paying in terms of the water used in their drilling and fracking processes. The low royalty payments we feel are matched by the incredibly low rates that the companies are paying for water, and that this would be an ideal time for the government to be looking at both the water rentals that are paid and the gas royalties and condensate royalties, do so all at once. And we will be, in a couple of days' time, we will be making that call publicly with a number of organizations, some of whom are on this call today. And I think I'll leave it at that.
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks so much, Ben. And you know, thanks for your years of work on this. You know, you've been really at the forefront of bringing this issue to the public eye. So I appreciate it. And we, as expected, we have lots of time for questions and discussion. We really wanted to give folks a chance to wrap their heads around this. I know there's lots of information that we've heard from our speakers, and so any questions that you have, you can see we're going to use the raised hand function. So if you go down to the bottom near your screen, there's a little happy face there with reactions, and if you have a question, you can hit raise hand, and Chloe, my colleague, is going to call on folks as they raise their hand with questions, and then if you prefer, you can put your question in the chat, and we'll get to some of those in between as well. So feel free to raise your hand, and Chloe will unmute you as your turn is up. If you can include who you're asking the question of, that's really helpful as well, of our guests. So
I just want to add that I've gone through the chat so far and pulled out some of the questions, and I see that our speakers and co-hosts have been responding to some of those as they come.
I see a question here from Marianne. Go ahead. Oh, sorry.
Oh, I think we keep clicking mute, ask to unmute. There you go. There we go.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I was really struck by Ben saying that most of the value for BC government has to do with the subsurface rights and not royalties. Is that proven anywhere? Is that can that be proven? Because that would make it that the BC government is in opposition to First Nations ever having their own land rights and being able to make decision over their lands. Do I understand correctly what you were saying, Ben?
By far the largest revenue stream has been the sale of subsurface rights, which is done under auction and allows the successful bidders to essentially sew up the rights to drill and produce gas and liquids in the subsurface. I will, when we complete our document over the next couple of days, we'll share it with people on the group, but there's a graph in the document that shows the revenue streams both for royalties and for land sales, and you'll see that the subsurface rights or land sales are form the overwhelming majority of the revenue, and very significantly those sales are typically one-time sales, although there can be cases where companies relinquish their subsurface rights and those subsurface rights can be put up for sale again. But as a percentage of the total revenue stream, those sales are by far the most significant revenue generators.
Okay, I have some questions I pulled from the chat. Some of them are about how to submit. So folks are wondering if they can submit from outside BC. We've mentioned that you all will receive an email with the main points to stress and a bunch of these resources. But yeah, folks outside BC, can they submit in an attempt to ban fracking all over the place? Any of our hosts want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah, certainly folks from outside British Columbia can submit a comment if they want to. The province is open to that. Obviously, you'll only be able to affect policy within British Columbia through this process. But yeah, outsiders are welcome to participate.
Okay, I'm going to combine a couple sort of strategy questions too. So someone was asking, how do we get media coverage on this air quotes nerdy issue? Because people would be outraged about this if they only knew. And others are wondering the politics behind this, why the government wouldn't collect the money.
Any of our expert speakers want to field that one?
Well, I'd like to just mention, like, I think one of the reasons we have a government that's very, very friendly to industry, and this is not dependent on the political party that's in charge in British Columbia, is there's this legacy idea that oil and gas development is a way to, it's a foundation for the province's economic development. You know, it's a powerhouse, it attracts investment and so on. And so there's a fear of losing that industry and transitioning to something else. And so you keep the rates really low. But a larger question is just that, there's corporate capture. We have people from the oil and gas industry who then end up in the BC Oil and Gas Commission. And the BC Oil and Gas Commission was set up as a one-stop shop to enable oil and gas production in government. So it's up to us as citizens to mobilize and get government to change its approach to the industry and no longer see it as to recognize that this is a liability, that we're more and more building up infrastructure and other things that are going to be stranded because this is a sunset industry. It's an industry that's increasingly a liability, and it's leaving costs across the landscape. Like, we haven't even touched on all the abandoned wells that are leaking methane after they're capped and need to be fixed. So there's so many issues to address here, but it's an outdated economic paradigm behind it all.
If I could say something in response, Tom, because I think it's important, and we do bring this up in the context in our submission. The government's discussion paper on this process wildly overstates the economic importance of this industry. So I think it's important for people to make the point that that the government's characterization of this industry and its economic importance is overstated. So the government is effectively saying that the sector represents 4% of our GDP, but it's essentially a misread of the economic accounts because it includes the mining sector. So if you actually factor the mining sector out, the contribution of oil and gas is about half that much, or 2% of GDP, and support activities might add another 0.2% to it. And in terms of direct jobs, we're talking somewhere around 3,000 workers that are employed directly by the upstream oil and gas industry in the province. So, it's not insignificant, but it's not a huge number. We need to be talking about winding this industry down, and winding this industry down by, among other things, increasing the royalty rates is not going to result in that great of an economic hit, especially if we start to move investment dollars into the green economy.
Did any of the speakers, was there somebody else who wanted to respond to that one? No, okay. Adrian, I'm gonna ask to unmute you.
Yes, Adrian Huff here. I have a question. About 8 or 9 years ago, I was part of a struggle against the Canada-China FIPA, which went through anyway. And my question is, and maybe it was covered, sorry, I missed a bit of the beginning, I had a phone call, but how do the various free trade agreements with other countries like China and the CETA and NAFTA, how do they affect our ability to fight against some of these projects which are so destructive?
I can start replying to that. I mean, I think the good news is that LNG is still mostly a fantasy in British Columbia. There's one major facility under construction, but there's really no LNG exports happening right now. So there aren't established trade ties. There is some gas that goes by pipeline to the United States, but most of it goes to Alberta to be used in the tar sands right now. So most of it is used within Canada. I think, actually, ironically, subsidies is something that free traders hate. It's why we had the softwood lumber fights with the United States for years and years. And more or less what we're doing with natural gas is very similar to that, charging rock bottom rates to subsidize an industry that isn't viable without government help.
Just a little corollary to that question. but what this talk of subsurface rights, I mean, I would think that there would be other countries, or America or anybody that might be interested in some of those things that can be mined from underneath the forests or underneath the various landmass, which we know as Canada. As
Your mic kind of petered out there, but it sounded like you were just saying, is there anyone who can address that? Subsurface rights, anybody?
Ben, you were speaking to the.
I'm sorry, but Adrian, you cut out completely on me. I didn't hear the question.
Yes. Yeah, I was just I was asking about. I mean, okay, if the fracking is it's this pipe dream, so to speak. What about the subsurface rights? I mean, are there people who have free trade agreements with us, with Canada, who would be interested in some of those subsurface rights that we might not be able to convince our own, even if we do win. I know that it happened in the Bilcon mine in I think Nova Scotia or New Brunswick. The Bilcon mine was able to successfully sue Canada for several $1 million because over 20 years, the entire local area fought against the building of this mine, which was going to upset the right whales. It was going to do all kinds of terrible things to the shoreline. Is that also a concern with things like subsurface rights? Because that, to me, I hear mining. Did you hear me okay?
I did. I'm not aware of any kind of international trade laws that would impact on those subsurface rights.
All right, we have a question about the royalty review, and it's how does the result of the royalty review potentially impact the future of proposed fixes, such as carbon capture and storage? And on a related note, does clean energy currently get any significant subsidies? Maybe
Well,
one of our campaigners or Vanessa?
Yeah,
to
I'm
speak
happy
that?
to pipe in. Sorry, I've fully transitioned to the couch because it's very late my time. So hopefully you can see me. I think that's a great point, actually, because we haven't, as far as I know, I don't think that's fully referenced in the discussion paper, but as you probably all know, there's a lot of discussion about how to incent companies to invest in technology that will allow them to reduce their emissions in the long term. And one of those key technological fixes would be carbon capture and storage. So I think that if anyone wants to preemptively push back against this notion, that would be helpful. I think, we mentioned in our presentations that subsidies and royalty credits that are supposed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions actually simply just lower the cost for producers, and they end up doing activities they would do anyways, and they don't necessarily increase their investments in green technology. I think that's probably a similar risk with carbon capture and storage as well. And because it's an unproven technology and really doesn't exist at scale, there is a huge risk that governments will start to put large amounts of resources into this. And we have seen that happen in Alberta already. Typically, when governments do incentivize carbon capture and storage, they do so through grants and loans. I don't necessarily think that would really happen through the royalty program, but I certainly wouldn't dissuade anyone from pushing back against the idea that will be a solution in the long term. There was a second part to that question, but I'm blanking on what it was. Chloe, if you could remind me.
For sure, it was if clean energy receive any significant subsidies currently in BC.
Right. Okay. I don't actually know, but I think this, so, and that the reason I don't know is because I mostly cover federal subsidies and mostly fossil fuels, not clean energy. But I think that, you know, there have been some questions in the chat also that have asked about, you know, proposing like solutions and alternatives, and also this fear that government is losing a revenue source. So a couple caveats. I wish I could have put a graph on the screen, but I didn't actually screenshot this. But it's mentioned by other people as well that the level of royalties that BC has been receiving from this industry have been plummeting in recent years. And so it is a concern that there isn't going, like, and this is a concern across the world, right? Because especially in places outside of Canada that are much more reliant on the fossil fuel industry, that they're going to have to create alternative sources of revenue for governments. In Canada, I would go back to what Ben noted about the fact that this industry is actually a very small percentage of BC's revenue. And that currently, right now, we're already not receiving a ton of money from this industry. So it's more about making sure that the current system is reflective of where we need to go, and then doing some long-term economic planning to figure out what alternative sources BC can look to increase its revenue. Over the long term, you know, I mentioned the idea that we need to be swapping subsidies from fossil fuels towards clean energy, or at least not distorting the market, so that clean energy solutions can be more accessible and more adopted. In the longer term, you know, it's foreseeable that once we have really established clean energy and renewable systems, that revenues from those industries can also be taxed in a way that provides funding for the government. But we're just not there yet. These are industries that are nascent, and they really need to be supported so that they can become mainstreamed and we can have clean energy across our economy. So I think we can get there, but in the short term, that's not necessarily going to be the solution. So while I wouldn't be so bold as to go and call for clean energy subsidies, because any kind of subsidy needs to be very carefully designed, I wouldn't hesitate and would encourage you to point out in your submissions that if government is going to have foregone revenue, it's much better that foregone revenue is supporting clean energy than fossil fuels.
Thank you. I have one technical answer, which is about the deadline for this public consultation. It is December 10th at 4 p.m. And now I'll turn it over to Patricia's question on video.
Hi. So I have a question that I have for Ben, and I'm not sure whether the comment that's been referred to twice now, saying that most value comes from the sale of subsurface rights, not from the royalties paid. Does that have any context in terms of making our pitch against what's being proposed by the government, or making them or our argument for changing the royalties? Or is that just a comment you made to illustrate that we're not making much money through royalties?
It is an excellent question. No, we have to be focused on the royalties, because that largely is the only thing that we can influence, right? So we have to be very cognizant of that. And again, I apologize for not being on the call earlier. And so I don't know if comments were made or observations made on this, but it is the reality that part of the reason for the decline in royalty revenues over the last many years is because natural gas prices overall have been extremely low, and royalties in part reflect that. As Sven noted, and it is very important to note, that the royalty payments would have been considerably higher had the credits, particularly the deep well credits, not existed. There's no justification, in our view, for those credits existing, because they were put in place initially to encourage companies to drill deeper and horizontal wells on the grounds that that technology was new and largely unproven and extremely expensive. That is no longer the case. So standard industry practice is to drill deep wells and horizontal wells, because the only gas that really is left to get is in those deeper shale zones. So we need to be focused on the royalty payments that are being paid. We need to get it right now, because gas rates are starting to go back up. So we want to ensure that at the very, very least, the public is getting a fair return on the value of the resource that is being extracted. So we do need to focus on the royalties, but it is unquestionably the reality that to date, a large amount of the revenues that have been collected have been on these one-time land sales. So what we're left to deal with is the smaller amount of revenue that is generated through royalties. And we want to definitely, I think, be speaking with one voice that the incredible subsidies that this industry has been given through things like the Deep Well Royalty Credit Program, which is the main one that we need to be worried about, as well as the infrastructure royalty credits and the credits on gas processing, are all reviewed and all result in increased charges to the industry. And I think, we really need to be focused on framing this in terms of, this is a one-time resource. We only get one kick at the can. We ought to be getting the highest return possible for that publicly owned resource. And we all need to acknowledge that the usage of that resource has to be wound down, and wound down very, very quickly. So we want to get the maximum we can from that resource now, while ensuring that there's less and less of it being produced.
Isn't it ironic that it's called a renewable resource by the province when it is really a one-time? I just have another question, because I don't know what other people here are like, but I don't have a background in this area. And we have two options, which is to respond to the formal questionnaire, and then the other one is to send an email. And do you have any thoughts about, should we just bring ourselves up to speed to respond to the questionnaire? Or do you think the emails are going to have equal weight? And anyone who wants to answer.
Sven, do you want to answer that, and then maybe we'll close this out?
I mean, I would suggest taking the time to write your own email if you can. You're probably, the questions in the questionnaire are designed to push you towards kind of the industry preferred options. So taking the time, even if you don't answer all of the questions that they lay out in their guide to submit written answers, I think you're better kind of putting the things you care about into an email and sending it to them. And if you really can't figure it out, there are the tools that we shared earlier on each of our 3 organizations' websites that have pre-written comments that you can customize or use as a starting place.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think we'll wrap up there. We said we'd be done at 8, but I want to thank our wonderful expert speakers for your time tonight. It's been really, really helpful to help wrap people's head around it. Reminder to folks, you will get an email tomorrow with all of the links that we've shared in the chat and some of the messaging, how to go about sending your review. And if you had any questions that didn't get answered tonight, just reply to that email and we'll make sure that that we can find an answer for you. Thanks again, everybody, for joining, and reminder that you've got till December 10th to submit, and we're going to end the biggest fossil fuel subsidy in the province. So let's do it.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye, everyone.